started to open by saying, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking. Let me say that most of my students and former students who are here would be appalled that I actually scripted myself. The notebook generally is here, and that's the way I work. But I was fearful that I would be nervous and maybe a little emotional. So I've actually written this, and I'll ask you to bear with me while I try to get through it. So I want to thank all of you who put forth the effort to attend this evening. Billed is my last lecture, although I fervently hope that that title is not to be taken literally. First of all, particular thanks are due to my dear colleague, Professor Samina Raja, to my friend, Dean Robert Shibley, to my old and very dear friend, Dean Emeritus Harold Cohen, to Professor Dan Hess, my friend and department chair. And I would be very remiss, I didn't know until very recently she was on the bill, and Jolie Hall, thank you. I'm astonished and amazed by what you had to say about me. I also want to thank Doug McCallum and Rachel Tiemann, who were instrumental in helping organize the presentation. They are wizards with the technologies. And the other longtime person in the department who is here, I don't know where she's sitting, there she is, Donna Rogalski, who many of you remember as department secretary. She just retired a couple of months ago, but Donna and I go back to her very first day on the job at UB. I actually helped to train her. And she retired about 2-3 months ago, and I told her, you could have hung around a couple of months. We could have done this together. So I'm glad we're going out at the same time, Donna. I want to thank all of my students and my former students who made a point of being here, and of course my many friends and colleagues. Thank you to you all. When Bob Shibley and then Chair Ernie Sternberg invited me out to a fancy restaurant for a sit-down lunch about 1.5 years ago, among other things, asked what I'd like them to do upon the occasion of my retirement. I responded, nothing special, please. Just invite friends and colleagues and the many alumni who it has been my privilege to teach to come to the final scheduled lecture in my Design of Cities course. And then afterwards we'll have wine and cheese out in the hallway and everybody will go home. Clearly my wishes did not prevail. Samina explained to me the concept behind the last lecture. And when I told my wife Barbara, she said, oh, Alfred, that's so very nice. You know, you can Google that phrase, the last lecture, and learn all about it, which I did. So for those of you who, like me, are unaware of the origin, the phrase derives from a popular professor of computer and electrical engineering at Carnegie Mellon University, who, when it was discovered at the tender age of 46, he'd been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. He agreed to deliver his last lecture open to the entire university community, to share what lessons he had learned about what is important in life beyond the narrow confines of his academic discipline. Now, I'm not aware whether Samina and my wife were engaged in wishful thinking or whether they took like any extra insurance policies, you know. I certainly hope not. So, second of all, let me say to everyone that I have not thus far been diagnosed with any terminal illness. If I may quote no lesser an authority than the late W.C. Fields, rumors of my premature demise have been greatly exaggerated. This is the same guy who, when he did expire, had the following words inscribed on his gravestone. Personally, I'd rather be in Philadelphia. As it is, I am perfectly happy to be retiring here in Buffalo, and I hope to be of some continuing value to my colleagues here at the School of Architecture and Planning, and across the university, and of course to our local civic community. I have always used slide images in my lectures in order to provide concrete examples to my students, hoping that a picture being worth 1,000 words, they would see the point I was trying to make and be able to connect to that. So once PowerPoint got developed, this old dog learned a new trick. And that meant I could put images up in TypeScript, which they could jot down, right, and then see pictures of what I was talking about. It all worked very nicely. Now, time is far too precious for me to deliver an academic lecture. That is not my intent. But I did want to share with you 2 slides that come from my teaching that capture in a very few words the core of what I have labored to instill in my students. The sentiment that you see on the screen, in my judgment, is at the heart of planning. We will ever strive for the ideals and sacred things of the city, both alone and with many. We will unceasingly seek to quicken the sense of public duty. We will revere and obey the city's laws. We will transmit this city not only not less, but greater, better, and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. It's important that we recall that ancient Athens, despite being the home of our modern-day concept of democracy, was in fact a republic, and that not all of its population were citizens. Indeed, in Plato's Republic, the ideal city-state was nearly half slaves, albeit not in the sense in which we understand that term today. Very nearly another third were freedmen, the military plus artisans and mechanics, who provided necessary skilled labor, but none of these were eligible for citizenship, though some few might earn that privilege after many years of faithful service. As a result of these limitations, my second slide, always shown to my undergraduates at the end of my course, Design of Cities, is attributed to another Republican, this time an American, whose name you will no doubt recognize as the 26th President of the United States. The conflict between the men who possess more than they have earned and the men who have earned more than they possess is the central condition of progress. The essence of the struggle is to equalize opportunity, destroy privilege, and give to the life of every individual the highest possible value, both to himself and to the Commonwealth. This uniquely American take on democracy has always seemed to me to be particularly important, perhaps even more so in the days and times in which we now live. It is critical that today's students understand the significance of these inspiring words and sentiments if they want to become planners. My career here has spanned 42 years, and I'd like to begin my reflections with an anecdote about my early experience at the flagship of the SUNY system. In 1977, then President Robert Ketter had been repeating a message to the schools and faculties over and over, hoping, I think, that repetition would drive the point home, right? Bring in more research. Research is the key to our institutional future. External financial support of the university enterprise is critical to our mission. In an attempt to have this point reinforced, Ketter invited the chancellor of the entire SUNY system, Dr. Ernest Boyer, to the Buffalo campus to give the faculty a pep talk. As a faithful citizen, I attended the address in the fancy auditorium of the music department, Slay Hall, out on the North Campus, and much to Ketter's chagrin and obvious consternation, Boyer launched into an address that afternoon extolling the virtues of teaching, admonishing the research faculty to remember that in spite of the importance of research to this particular senior campus, we should never overlook the centrality of teaching to the mission of the university. Chancellor Boyer that day posed a proposition to us that I remember to this day. Jerry Rising, you might have been there with me, and Claude Welch. And I would ask each of you in the audience to engage with this question as Boyer challenged us. Think back on your own pasts, each of you. Isn't there somewhere in your background a teacher who made all the difference in your life? Indeed, in your career. This was answered with thunderous applause. Then he asked us, have you ever gone back and thanked a teacher? Many heads hung low at this point as we reflected upon the truth that most of us had never done so. So then tonight, as I consider the lessons of my life with you, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the many teachers I have had who altered the course of my life by teaching not so much a subject or a course of study, but a set of values that have served as the nourishment for my intellect as well as my spirit. As with most of you, my very first teacher was my mother, but more about what I learned from her later. The first teacher I wish to thank is Miss Alice Smith, who taught me in the 5th grade at Public School 53 here in Buffalo. She was one of those old-fashioned school marms who was absolutely no nonsense in school. But she had an uncanny knack for communicating a sense to her students that you can do it. To all of my colleagues here in the School of Architecture and Planning, as you teach, remember that we are not simply dispensing information. We are seeking to make our students thirsty for knowledge. What I learned from my 5th grade teacher, Miss Smith, was always to encourage others. Thank you, Miss Smith. The next teacher I wish to thank is Mrs. Weta Clapp, my 7th grade English teacher. Of all the teachers I've ever had, no one went farther beyond the job description or even the proverbial call of duty than Mrs. Clapp. And I am certain that she didn't get paid extra for it. But she called out about a dozen of her promising students and invited us to stay after school 2 afternoons a week for what she called creative writing classes. When we would arrive, she would already have erased the big blackboard in her room and written on it a quotation from some famous person. A scholar, a statesman, a poet, a writer, sometimes even a sports hero. She would ask us to take out a blank sheet of paper and to write our interpretation of those statements. She would correct our essays without grading them, but she would write comments upon them in which she offered guidance and suggestions for how our essays could be improved. Often she would have us read essays by distinguished writers that she thought might encourage us to see what she was trying to do. Another thing that Mrs. Clapp did for me personally was she offered to become my speech teacher and public speaking coach. Once getting my parents to agree, she had them get me to school by 7:30 a.m. 3 mornings a week for nearly a year. School didn't even start in those days until 8:20 in the morning. During that 45 minutes, Mrs. Clapp would work with me on my elocution, pronunciation and enunciation, pace of delivery, control of the timbre of my voice. Once having coached me through the basics, she brought in her own tape recorder from home and had me record my speeches, playing them back to me, providing feedback and guidance. Her payday, so to speak, was when I won the Richmond Speaking Contest for the entire city of Buffalo Public Schools. Mrs. Clapp, I thank you for your devotion. It has been an inspiration to me all my life, even when I was not conscious of it. The next teacher I wish to thank is Mr. Dan Kublitz, who taught public speaking and drama at Bennett High School. Because of Mrs. Clapp's early work with me, Kublitz grabbed me in my early high school years, trained me further, and I eventually entered many oratorical contests and was successful. What I learned from Mr. Kublitz was the necessity of preparation. I was on the negative debate team. I was actually captain of the negative debate. And you know, they have affirmative and negative sides. You take on an issue and the teams go at it and see what they can do. He would have us practice in front of our teachers of history, of English, of science. And we'd be debating something like nuclear war. Right? We would prepare counter-arguments to the other side's arguments and put them on 3x5 cards. The job of one member of each of our teams was to listen to our opponent's points. These people didn't speak, they didn't debate, they just listened carefully and planned our responses. Kublitz's motto, be prepared for anything they can throw at you. He instilled in us such self-confidence that we entered every debate feeling we could not lose. Later in my life, I would read Virgil's Aeneid. And the line from that work that stuck in my head was, they can because they believe they can. And Julie, that's a sentiment I shared with young black high school kids all over the northeastern United States. They can because they believe they can. Thank you, Mr. Kublitz. The next teacher I want to thank is my high school humanities teacher, Mrs. Elizabeth Nuschel. To get the attention of her honors program students, she convinced our high school principal to let her throw out the conventional wooden, you remember those wooden desks with the metal thing and the thing went up and down, right? She got rid of all of those and brought in tablet armchairs like you'd have in a college classroom. Talk about an environmental designer. Nuschel changed the attitudes of us, her students, just by having us walk into a classroom where we felt as if we were already in college. One by one, she would have us excused from our study halls and come to her office where she would interview us personally to get to know us. On the basis of that, she would then suggest an author whose work she thought we might enjoy. In my case, Eugene O'Neill, whose maudlin dramas appealed to the dying hero complex in my troubled adolescent soul. What I learned from Mrs. Nuschel was how to appreciate life's nuances, its subtleties, to read below the surface, to search for meaning beyond what was apparent. She gave us a love of the art of poetry, of drama, of good prose writing. She actually escorted us to Stratford-on-Avon in Ontario each spring to expose us to the best of what was available at that time in the Buffalo-Niagara region. Thank you, Mrs. Nuschel. Next, I want to thank a college professor who later became my undergraduate thesis advisor in the Department of Sociology, Professor Steve Kleinberg. What Steve instilled in me was inquisitiveness. As a classroom instructor, Kleinberg had a knack for explaining the inexplicable. His course in social psychology was, to me, a complete eye-opener. Most lecture classes at Princeton in those days were fairly small, maybe 100 students at most, the average being about 50 or 60, with the exception of freshman 101 classes. Kleinberg's teaching was so extraordinary that the university used to have to seat his classes in the auditoria that were reserved for distinguished speaker series. I mean, that seated thousands. It was ridiculous, right? To this day, I can remember details of principles that I learned in Steve's classes. Thank you, Professor Kleinberg. Next, I wish to thank another Princeton undergraduate teacher, Suzanne Keller, also a sociologist. At the time, she was the only woman full professor on an otherwise all-male campus. And as you can imagine, she would have to have been. She was an extraordinary teacher, researcher, and scholar. Following my graduation, I took a job teaching at the then newly created New Jersey School of Architecture at NJIT, and Professor Keller was instrumental in seeing that I was invited to become a member of the visiting committee to the Department of Sociology at Princeton. At a meeting of that committee during my first year of college teaching, Keller asked me privately about my experience at NJIT. When I commented that students at NJIT weren't of the same caliber as Princeton students, she immediately admonished me that I was never to demean any student who I was teaching. Never, ever to place myself above them. Teaching, she explained, is a sacred duty, and my job was to advance the knowledge of each and every student committed to my care, and to assist each in achieving his or her goals. In the same way that a physician does not stop to ask the level of ability of an injured person, their job is to heal. In our case, to educate, not to pass judgment. Thank you, Professor Keller, for that important lesson in humility. Next, there are two professors from graduate school who I wish to thank. The first is Hanno Weber, with whom I studied architecture, in particular the design of social housing. To Hanno, the most critical part of social housing design was what the architects call the programming phase. That is, the initial step in the design process where the designer seeks to understand the nature of the problem. My late father was a public housing project manager for the bulk of his professional career, and so what I learned from Hanno Weber was something that I had experienced at the knee of my father as I was growing up. In design terminology, I'd put it this way. Don't design it if you wouldn't live in it yourself. Having survived graduate study in architecture and having made the transition successfully to urban planning, during my final year of grad school, I was struggling to complete my master's thesis on a topic of a new form of urban housing that I was persuaded could help rejuvenate older northeastern industrial cities. Not surprisingly, my case study was Buffalo. I can recall suffering a severe case of writer's block and walking into the office of Professor Julian Wolpert, the distinguished geographer, who was serving as my thesis advisor. I broke down in tears in Julian's presence, saying that I was a failure, that I would never finish graduate school. Julian listened patiently and then very gently explained that I was suffering from what he diagnosed as separation anxiety. He asked me how old I was when I started grammar school. 4.5, I replied. And you went straight through grade school to high school and then to college? Yes, I answered. He said, did you go straight to grad school after college? Oh, no, I said. I worked for 2 years as an administrator at Harvard running a special education project. Okay, he said. And after that, 4 years of grad school here? Yes, I answered meekly. And how old are you now, he wanted to know? 28, I replied. So in fact, he said, you've been institutionalized for 80% or more of your life, including adulthood. Of course, that fact had never dawned on me. Then Julian floored me. He said, you know, Al, you could apply to stay on and complete your PhD here under my supervision. Then you could join the faculty somewhere and you'd never have to leave the bosom of the academy. See, the absurdity of it all hit me in the face and I laughed through my tears. Julian said, look, Al, your thesis is fine. It's interesting work that needs to be done and you're the best person to do it. Now go home, get to work. Just stick with it. Never give up. Never give up. At that moment, he could have been Sir Winston Churchill speaking to inspire the British people in the face of Hitler's onslaught. I thanked him, I left, I finished my thesis on time with my class. Thank you, Julian Wolpert. There are 4 other people from whom I learned important life lessons, though I cannot say I was formally one of their students. The first of these is a man named Harlan Thompson, my first boss when I was fresh out of grad school. He was then the dean of the New Jersey School of Architecture, and during my first year there, Harlan lost his administrative assistant, a young guy named Paul Groth, who resigned to return to graduate school and work on his PhD at Berkeley under the distinguished scholar J.B. Jackson. I mentioned to Harlan that I had some administrative experience between college and graduate school, and if he needed any help in the short run, I would be happy to assist if the work was something that Harlan thought I understood or knew about. 2 days later, he handed me a routine assignment, which I took home, completed that same night, and brought back into him typewritten on office letterhead the next morning, ready for his signature. A day later, another assignment appeared in my mailbox, and I dispatched that one the same way. 2 days passed, and yet another chore was handed to me, but it was a Thursday, so I turned it around over the weekend, had it completed and back on Harlan's desk the following Monday. That same Monday night, Harlan invited me out to dinner and offered me the opportunity to become his assistant dean, keeping my faculty rank, by the way. I hesitated to answer and finally said, I'm not sure I could work for a guy who piles so much work on his people. And he said, well, good grief, I am glad to finally hear you complain. Never forget this. My job as the boss is to push you as hard as I can. Your job is to do your best to deliver, and when you can't do any more, to squeak. That way I understand what your capacity is, and I will never push you beyond your limits. Thank you, Harlan Thompson, for that lesson. I want next to thank the best boss I ever worked for, Dean Harold Cohen, here at UB. I understood that part of my job was to assist him, and by extension the school, by helping generate external funding to support our work. As someone pointed out earlier, I started my job here on July 17th, 1977. The first externally funded contract I brought in was in September of that same year. Shortly after that, with a Buffalo mayor newly elected, Harold began to pursue what became known as the Entertainment District Project. You all would call it the Theater District Plan. When the final report on that project was made public, it contained so much detail about what to do and how to do it that the local community was gaga. Some overly zealous newspaper reporter spotted a real estate transaction in the 500 block of Main Street with the name Cohen on it and wrote an article suggesting that the Dean of Architecture somehow held a profit interest in some downtown land deal. I recall vividly the various shades of Harold's reaction: anger, disappointment, resentment, astonishment. But we pulled through it. We cleared the matter up inside of 2 weeks, and that whole matter did not derail the project, of which today we are all beneficiaries. This is what I learned from Harold. We are not here for ourselves. We are here to serve others, to work on behalf of the good of the community, a sacred public trust. Thank you, Harold, for that lesson. The final two people I wish to thank for what I've learned from them will not surprise you at all. My first teacher, my mother, Virginia, and my wife, Barbara. I think the American language, and for that matter, even Standard English, is impoverished because we have only one word to use for such a broad spectrum of feelings. The consequence of that is the overuse, misuse, and abuse of the word love. Oh, I love your new hairdo. Gosh, I love my new car. I love my girlfriend. I love my dog. The list is endless. Ask any 100 people if they'd like to be in love, and they'll say yes. Ask the same 100 to define love, and you'll get 100 different definitions. The deepest confusion conflates romantic love with emotions that are as important, if not more so. It probably doesn't surprise anyone to hear me say I love my mother, but almost everyone understands that does not express romantic love. Listen to this passage from the 13th chapter of the first letter of St. Paul to the church at Corinth. Some of you will recognize it because it is often read at wedding ceremonies, which is how we get it confused and entangled with romantic, or more accurately, affectional love. Forget that kind of love for a moment and just ruminate upon these words from Holy Scripture. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. How many of us have ever been loved like that? How many can claim to love like that? Think how much better our neighborhoods, our cities, and indeed our nation will be when we reach a point where we are more concerned about being loving than we are about being right. Thanks, Mom. Finally, I want to thank my wife Barbara, from whom I have learned the lesson of forgiveness. Not for what I have had to forgive in her, because that is inconsequential, but for what I have learned time after time as she has forgiven me. None of us is perfect, and we should not hold ourselves to an unreasonable standard. While it is sometimes hard to forgive others, it can be even harder to learn to forgive ourselves. Now, that is the sum of what I think I have learned that is worth sharing. And in closing, I have always terminated my undergraduate lecture courses with a bit of poetry. Partly because one day I was walking across the Princeton campus and there was a construction fence up with the little holes so people could see what they were building. And someone had scrawled in little tiny ink script a quote from William Carlos Williams. "It is difficult to get the news from poems, but men die needlessly every day for want of what is found there." In that spirit, I share with you these lines from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, in which the poet suggests old men ought to be explorers. And he also writes, "In my end is my beginning." The final poem in the quartets is titled Little Gidding, and it begins its final section with the words that you see on the screen. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time." I thank you all for coming, and I wish you Godspeed.